So, does anybody remember the website from a long time ago, before some of you were born actually, called Hot or Not? No, nobody remembers this. So, in the year 2000, a website came out, I'm not kidding, where people would upload, anybody heard about this? No? Okay, where people would upload a video, a picture of yourself to the internet, where the internet would rate your attractiveness on a scale of 1 to 10. This existed, and I have all kinds of questions. Question number one, what kind of emotional masochist would put their picture on the internet for the denizens of the internet to comment? Question number one. Question number two, who wakes up on a given day and says the best thing that I can do with the time that God has given me is open the internet and rate the attractiveness of strangers? Do you get the idea, right? Are these the people, and this sounds really judgy, I'm sorry, but are these the people who you would trust with rating anything at all, let alone your appearance, right? But this website, lest you think that I just pulled something out of the air, this website was actually, and I kid you not, a week after launch, one of the 25 most popular websites in the world. People loved it. Because we are so desperately curious to know what people think of us, aren't we? We're so desperately curious to know what people think of us, which ruins the Jewish story. And that's where I get to this week's Torah portion. Parshat Shalach Lecha, the Jewish story is actually ruined with this desire to know what other people think. So here's what happens. We are very close to the promised land. Right close, from Alabama we say right close, right? We are right close. The promised land is right over there. There's some hills. We're in the barren wasteland. There's some hills. On the other side of the hills is the promised land. The temperature's dropping. We can smell the land of milk and honey. We are right there. And so what does Moses do? Anybody here goes out to a fancy restaurant, even though you know the restaurant's good, you want to read the reviews, right? Moses wants to get the reviews. So he sends 12 scouts into the promised land to come back and tell us what the promised land is like. And like anything reviewed, even the promised land, it gets mixed results. So we have, how many scouts were there? Anybody remember? 12. We have 12 scouts. 10 of them come back and they say the land is horrible. The land, and I'm going to quote here, the land is a land that devours its inhabitants. The land is the end of our story. The land will destroy us. We can enter into the promised land, but we'll be crushed, we'll be defeated. This is the end of us. This God-forsaken land is the end. That's what the 10 say. But there are two more. We have the two. The two are Joshua and Caleb, and we're going to come back to them in a minute. Joshua and Caleb say, yes, it's not going to be easy entering into the promised land, but what's the promised land called? The land of what and what? The land of milk and honey. This is a land that is beautiful. This is a land that is bountiful beyond anything you have ever seen. This is a land that God will help deliver to us. And I'm paraphrasing here, but just like God redeemed us from Egypt with the 10 plagues, just like God split the sea, just like God, do you notice Israelites? The two say how 1.2 million Israelites could travel through this barren wasteland and still have food to eat? God took care of that. Remember how 1.2 million Israelites, you were wandering through this barren wasteland and you had water to drink, right? God took care of that. Look at your shoes, Israelites, not you, but look at your shoes. Notice how over the span of 2 years they haven't worn thin? Miracle. Look at the shirt on your back. Notice how it's still intact just as you left Egypt? Miracle. God has redeemed you before. God is going to redeem you now. It's not going to be easy, the two say, but you can do it. So why then do we listen to the 10 and not the 2? And just to add a little zhuzh to the question, we've never heard of these 10 before. These 10, anybody ever heard the name Shemua before? No? Shaphat, anybody know a Shaphat? No? But remember who the 2 are. Who are the 2? Joshua and Caleb. Raise your hand if you know a Joshua. Perfect, hands down. Raise your hand, less common today, if you know a Caleb. Fantastic. These are people who we've heard of before. These are the Gedolei Hador. These are the great people of their generation. They are Moses' essentially understudies. Everybody knows, trusts, listens to, admires Joshua and Caleb. So again, why do we listen to the nobody 10s instead of Joshua and Caleb 2s? Why do we listen to these and not these? Now, the problem, and this is especially true if you're growing up, is the more times some people say things, or the more people who tell you things about you, the more likely you are to believe them. And when you are growing up, this is especially challenging, and it makes it compoundingly more difficult, because when you are growing up, this is when you start learning the story that you tell about yourself. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on who your parents are, your grandparents are, your teachers are, your mentors are, your counselors are, the people you look up to are, fortunately or unfortunately, the story you tell about yourself is formed by other people. And you don't get to choose who those people are. Even when you think you're choosing your friends. When you're a kid, if you're young enough, right, it's not your friend, it's your parents get together with their friends, and then you're stuck in a room with a silly kid who picks his nose for 2 hours, right? You have no control when you are young over the things that other people tell you. And if they tell it to you enough, you're going to believe it. If they tell it to you enough, you are going to believe it. And one of the things that I thought when I was a kid is that when you grow up is when you figure out all your stuff. Turns out when you grow up, you just carry a lot more of it. Because whether you are a parent, a grandparent, great-grandparent, aunt or uncle or cousin, you are still holding on to the failures, fears, disappointments, insecurities that you grew up with that were handed down to you. Because what do you do with your stuff? You give it to your kids. You give it to your kids. And unless you are careful, if enough people tell you something, you are going to believe it about you. So what happens when you let your 10 in? What happens when you let those 10 or 20 or however many you have into your heart, into your story? What happens when you let them in? Well, I'll tell you, there are a couple different ways to respond. But first, let me just tell you what these 10 do. Let me tell you, because I don't know who your 10 are. And it might be a different number for you. But I do know in the Parsha, I can tell you what your 10 say, just based on the Parsha alone. You know what your 10 say? They say, you can't. You won't. You're not smart enough. You're not strong enough. You're not capable enough. You're not kind enough. You're not hot or not enough. You are not. That promised land's in front of you. It's not going to be yours. It's not going to be yours. And when you let that voice inside, there are two responses. The first is you can believe them. Anybody here know somebody with failure to thrive, right? Who has a challenge in front of them, a great opportunity in front of them? Oh boy, and they'll sit that one out. And they'll sit that one out just like they sat out the other one. And just like they sat out the one before. It's not because people don't want to thrive. It's not because people don't want to do well and realize their potential in life. It's because every single time something comes their way that could be a blessing or an opportunity, the 10 grab that megaphone and say, no, not now, no, not ever. You can try, but it's just going to end like all the other ones have since your earliest memory of this. That's what the 10 can do. It can break you. It can break you if you let them in. Now, there's another response, which is in some ways the opposite, but ruins you nonetheless. If you let the 10 in. Anybody know somebody who walks through life with a chip on their shoulder? Just desperate to prove themselves to someone else. Desperate to prove themselves to anybody who they might come in contact with. Desperate to show how smart they are, how accomplished they are, how tough they are. You walk through life, if you let these 10 in, they're screaming at you in here. You know what you do? You just scream louder. And then you spend your whole life screaming at those voices inside, at the people unfortunate enough to interact with you, intersect with your life. Either way, when you let them in, they're going to ruin you. And so how can you let fewer people into your story? And I don't talk usually about the sermon process with you all. It is a process, and it was a very difficult process, especially for young rabbis. If you ever have a young rabbi who's giving you a sermon, it doesn't matter if it's good or not, just tell him it's great. Because no one has any idea how to do this, especially early on. And so early on for me. And Lauren knows this. Oh, God. Remember the sermon writing process? It was torture. So I would write a sermon that I thought I liked. I would send it to not one, not two, but 5 editors. I would send it to the first one, and they would add their comments, thoughts, life experiences, and perspectives into the sermon. And what does the young rabbi do? You bring it all in. You kind of rearrange everything. Send it to the next editor, who does the same thing with their stuff. Send it to the next editor, who does the same thing, to the next, and then it comes back to me. And if I weren't careful, and maybe some of you here were here to hear some of these sermons, I'm sorry, right? You get a boring blob of a Frankenstein sermon that doesn't make sense because it's everybody else's ideas except for yours, right? If you let too many people in, it's going to ruin your story. It's going to ruin your sermon. It's going to ruin the Jewish story, their Jewish trajectory, and it can ruin your life if you let too many people in. In fact, this Jewish story hinges on this moment. It is this Parsha, not when the Israelites complained about the manna or the water, not even when we built the golden calf. It's this moment when we let too many people in that changed the course of Jewish history. Because after this moment, the entire generation just about to enter into the promised land spends the next 38 years in the wilderness. They all die, the older generation dies in the wilderness and never enters the promised land. It's this moment when you let too many people in that guarantees you will never get to the place you want to go. So who gets to tell you if you're smart or kind? Who gets to tell you if you're accomplished or capable? Who gets to tell you if you're hot or not, right? Who do you let in? And you have to be choosy here. You have to be choosy because there are all kinds of people who have all kinds of thoughts, who have all kinds of opinions. Most of them are irrelevant to you. Our Torah says, our tradition says, that one of the most important things we can do with our lives is ta'aseh lecha rav. Ta'aseh lecha rav, to make for yourself a rabbi, really a teacher. To choose your teachers, to choose the people who you let in, to choose the people who you listen to. This is the most important decision you can make. Choose the people who you look up to, who you admire. Choose the people who believe in you, and choose the people who you believe in, right? This is a two-way street. You choose your teachers. Be selective about the people who you let in. Choose the few and reject the rest. Choose the few and reject the rest, because your story is too important to be left to the mob. It's too important to be left to the voting majority of who has said the most things to you over the span of your years. Your story is not a democracy. It's a choice. So choose wisely. Make for yourself a rabbi. Let them help you tell your story. And then maybe, just maybe, you with them by your side can walk toward that promised land. Shabbat shalom. Good job. Good job.